Earlier in the course, we talked about SD access, and we went through how SD access could use intent-based networking, and it could grant permissions based on identity rather than IP address. Well, a portion of SD access is a feature called TrustSec. In fact, TrustSec, that's what gives IP access its segmentation and policy features. However, you can use TrustSec on its own, and we want to talk a bit more about TrustSec in this video. To get started, though, let's remind ourselves what we discussed when we talked about SD access. We talked about the problem of IP-based security. I gave you the example of maybe a professor at a university. They're in their office, they're at PC 1 with an IP address of 192.168.1.100, and there is an access control list that's going to permit that subnet that faculty member is on, that's going to permit that subnet to reach a server at 192.0.2.3. So if that faculty member is in their office, no problem. They have an explicit ACL that says, yes, you can get to that server. However, let's say that PC1 is a laptop and that faculty member, they take it to the campus library or maybe a classroom and they connect to the network there. Well, they've got a different IP address. In this case, PC1 now has an IP address of 203.0.113.125. And if they try to get to that very same server that faculty should have access to, they're not going to get there because there's not an access control list that permits that new IP address to get to the server. And that's a big issue with IP-based security. The good news is TrustSec lets us grant permission based on someone's identity rather than their IP address. So let's say that, Kevin, let's say that I'm on PC1 and I'm in my office. Well, when I log into the network, I'm going to be authenticated by Cisco ISE, Cisco's Identity Services Engine. And the ISE configuration has a security group called faculty, and maybe a couple of members of the faculty group are Kevin and Charles. And there's a configuration that says everyone in this faculty security group is going to be assigned a tag, a security group tag, or an SGT of 50. So now that I've logged in, any traffic coming from my machine is going to be tagged with a SGT of 50, and maybe server 1, it has an SGT of 10. Now, instead of having a regular access control list that allows one IP address or one subnet to get to a destination IP address, we're going to have a security group access control list, or an SG-ACL, and maybe it says that we permit security group 50 to access security group 10. So if I'm in my office, no problem. Based on my security group tag, my identity in other words, I'm allowed to get to that server, but if I take my laptop and go somewhere else on campus, I'm still going to log in, I'm still going to be authenticated by Cisco ISE, and I'm still going to be given a security group tag of 50. So based on that identity, I'm still going to be able to get to that server. And now that we've reviewed this big advantage of TrustSec, let's talk a bit more about how TrustSec works step by step. Recalling that it's all based on this security group tag. That is a 16-bit tag that's going to be assigned to our traffic. And TrustSec breaks down into 3 different phases. There is a classification phase, a propagation phase, and an enforcement phase. The classification phase begins when the user logs in. And when they log in, they might be authenticated using 802.1x. And with 802.1x, a user is typically authenticated with a radius server. However, we might have some devices that don't support 802.1x. Maybe we have a printer or some sort of surveillance camera, maybe a badge reader, and let's say that they do not support 802.1x. Well, there's a fallback mechanism, and it's called MAB, MAC Authentication Bypass. And MAB allows the device to be authenticated based on its MAC address. Now, it's preferable that we use 802.1x, but at least we have MAB as a fallback. The classification phase continues as Cisco ISE assigns a security group tag to that user's traffic. And it's going to be the job of one of our switches to assign that tag to that traffic. And we might have a tag for different groups. Maybe employees get a tag of 10, contractors get a tag of 20, and maybe guests, they get a tag of 30. And the propagation phase is about how the traffic flows through the network. And the preferable method here is to do inline tagging. That's where the SGT is embedded inside of the Ethernet frame, but we might have some legacy devices that don't support that. In that case, we can use an alternative. It's called SGT Exchange Protocol, or SXP. That's going to allow us to communicate IP to SGT mappings out of band. And finally, the enforcement phase uses not regular access control lists, but security group access control lists, SGACLs. That's where our tags get examined and a permit or deny decision is made based on those tags. And that's a look at the operation of TrustSec, a feature that lets us create a security policy based not on IP address, but based on identity.